Good day all. This talk will examine the tradition of structuralism. The structuralist tradition was the first to emerge in sociology. This is because the French structuralist Auguste Comte, who lived from 1798 to 1857, invented the word sociology and so became the first sociologist. Comte believed that the time had come for the study of society to be not just a branch of philosophy, which it always had been, but also a branch of science. He developed an approach he called positive philosophy or positivism, in which he argued that only science could establish positive facts about the universe. Just as the natural sciences used facts to establish the abstract laws that govern nature, so sociology would use social facts to establish the laws that govern society. Comte used the natural sciences, specifically biology, as his starting point. He developed what he called the organic analogy, which argues that society works like a biological organism. Just as an organism is made up of organs that perform specialized functions, but all work together for the survival of the body as a whole, so too society is made up of social structures that perform the functions necessary for the survival of society as a whole. This model is the starting point of the whole structuralist tradition in sociology. Comte went on to argue that sociology would become the ultimate science. It would be the most important science of all because it would teach us how to make society run properly. Unfortunately, Comte had difficulty in getting people to take his ideas seriously and even in getting a job, and in his later years, quite frankly, he went a bit screwy. He proclaimed that sociology, while still being a science, was also a new religion for humanity, and that he was its high priest. He predicted that someday the whole world would be run by sociologist priests. Some people actually liked this idea, and for a time he had a significant following, not just in France, but also other European countries. But for scientists, this turn to religion just invalidated Comte's thinking altogether, and he is little read these days. I would argue that, like everyone else, Comte had his pros and his cons. He had some really good ideas and some really screwy ideas. The same can be said of the next major figure in this tradition, Herbert Spencer, who lived from 1820 to 1903. Spencer was the first English sociologist. Like Comte, he argued that social structures are analogous to biological structures. The main difference between Comte and Spencer was that Comte focused on cooperation, while Spencer focused on conflict. Spencer argued that social evolution, like biological evolution, took place through what he called the survival of the fittest. This phrase was not coined by Charles Darwin, as most people think, but by Spencer several years before Darwin published his work. Darwin termed the process natural selection. It means that the strong survive and so reproduce, while the weak die off. So, over time, the species improves and gets fitter or better able to survive. It is part of how evolution works, but not all of it, as Spencer thought. Spencer argued that society would be better off over the long term if it just allowed the weak to die off. He said the government should stop interfering in the economy, all social programs should be scrapped, and the sick and weak should just be allowed to die. These days, some would call this improving the gene pool. At the time, it was called social Darwinism. It became quite popular with some right-wingers in the 19th century, and to some extent it still is. However, in the 20th century, most people came to accept that the creation of the welfare state was a good thing, and that Spencer's ideas were not just screwy, they were downright immoral. Implementing them would make society as a whole more immoral, and so would be a step backwards in social evolution, not a step forward. It would also waste the human potential of the differently abled. For example, it would have deprived us of one of the greatest scientific minds of our time, the quadriplegic cosmologist Stephen Hawking. Back in France, Comte's work was taken up by Emile Durkheim, who lived from 1858 to 1917. Durkheim remains one of the big names in sociological theory to this day. He developed a more sophisticated structuralist model of society, focusing particularly on the relationship between society's division of labor and its collective conscience. In other words, between its economy and its culture. He said that society had to keep upgrading its division of labor to keep up with an ever-growing population, and that this inevitably led to changes in society's collective conscience, in its norms, values, and morals. He also said that modern society had developed high levels of anomie. This is a French term which can be translated as alienation or isolation or social separation. Anomie remains the principal sociological explanation for seemingly senseless acts of violence, such as the spate of school shootings in recent years. They are performed by individuals who've been cut off from society. Durkheim also argued that society's division of labor has become anomic because it has opened up a social gulf between the rich business class and the rest of society. The rich have rights and privileges which are denied to the rest. As people have grown increasingly aware that there is one law for the rich and another for the rest, respect for the law has declined, and the collective conscience and common morality have been weakened. Durkheim believed that there was a solution for this. In his day, democracy came with a property requirement, which meant that only the rich were allowed to vote or stand for political office. Durkheim believed in universal suffrage, or one person, one vote, which was implemented in Europe shortly after his death. He thought that this more representative democracy would allow for the election of representatives of all of society's main social groups, who could then work out what he called a new social contract, which would include a more equitable division of labor and a more equitable division of the rewards of that labor. This has happened up to a point, but it hasn't reduced social inequality as much as Durkheim hoped it would. After Durkheim, European sociology largely turned away from structuralism and towards Marxism. But structuralism didn't die, it just immigrated to the US. At Harvard in the 1930s, Talcott Parsons, who lived from 1902 to 1979, developed the approach he called structural functionalism. As the name implies, this theory sees society as made up of social structures performing specialized functions, the same as Comte, Spencer, and Durkheim. Parsons explicitly built on the work of Durkheim in particular. By the 50s, Parsons had become the biggest name in American sociology, and his structural functionalism dominated the discipline. But in the 60s, he came under heavy attack. He was criticized first of all for what I like to call terminological inflation, or big words for small ideas. Parsons invented his own terminology as he went along, and critics said that you needed a Parsons to English dictionary just to understand him. And once you did, you realized that all he'd done was to create a lot of new terminology, but hadn't actually said much of anything with it. He was also criticized in the 60s by Marxists and feminists for being too conservative. His theory stated that society was steadily getting more functional, or gradually improving, and that US society in particular was the best in the world. Critics argued that this might be true in Parsons' cozy, male, white, middle-class world, but not so much for the poor, women, African Americans, and other minorities. Robert Merton, who is probably the second best-known structural functionist, was more critical of American society and pointed out that social structures could be more functional for some than for others. Indeed, he said, structures could even be dysfunctional for the majority of society, but still persist, as long as they were functional for the rich and powerful. Nicholas Luhmann, a student of Parsons, developed his own variation on structural functionalism termed systems theory. He developed a new theory because he rejected Parsons' terminology as too abstract and too difficult to understand. Unfortunately, his own terminology is just as abstract and difficult to understand. When Western society turned to the left in the 60s, structural functionalism went into a decline. As it had been in Europe half a century earlier, structuralism was pushed aside by Marxism, now supplemented by feminism. However, when Western society turned back to the right in the 80s, it was reborn as Neofunctionalism, which just means the new functionalism. American theorists like Jeffrey Alexander developed a more sophisticated form of functionalism, integrating ideas from other theories, such as Marxism's focus on social conflict rather than social cooperation. However, in the late 90s, Alexander declared that for him, the neo-functionalist project was complete, and he was going on to other things. There are other neo-functionist theorists, but only in the US. Outside of the US, structuralism is currently in a decline. It has been attacked by post-structuralism, which has become postmodernism. As postmodernism has become more popular, its explicit rejection of structure as an analytical concept has undermined the structuralist tradition. However, history shows us that such intellectual trends are cyclical, and I believe that structuralism will make a comeback in time. A written transcript of this talk is available in the video description box if you're interested. Good day all.